64. Part 4. All right, let's get started. All right, whoever stayed, thank you for staying. Appreciate it. Here we go. The new regime. Let's see what we learned today. Mexico's economic promise lay in the extraction of gold and silver based on indigenous labor. Yet across the Atlantic, Spanish reformers wished to do away with both the encomendas and indigenous slaves. The struggle between reformers and slave owners had been brewing for decades, but things finally came to a head in 1539 when King Charles I ordered the Audiencia. Officials in Mexico were stunned. After days of heated discussion, the Audiencia wrote back to the monarch imploring him to reconsider. Along with their petition, they included questionnaires filled out by some of the oldest and most respected colonialists who had answered leading questions that sometimes ran half a page or more. For example, Hernan Cortez first came to Mexico. He found a Spaniard named Geronimo del Aguilera, who had been shipwrecked before and had been held as a slave by the indigenous peoples for many years in a land called Yucatan. Quote, do you know that the indigenous peoples of Mexico have had and continue to have many slaves in their power, and that they ordinarily buy them and sell them peacefully in their tangus. Questions such as these were intended to show that indigenous people had enslaved other indigenous people long before the Spaniards arrived. Other questions were meant to draw attention to the beneficial effects of the institution, including the following, quote, do you know that the indigenous people of the outlying areas are idolaters and eat human flesh, end quote. Quote, do you know that the slaves held by indigenous peoples of Mexico are well treated and are being instructed in our holy Catholic faith, end quote. The last section of the questionnaire touched on the economic matters. Quote, do you know that in Mexico there are not enough workers and slaves are needed to extract gold and silver and grow food and other things, and that if His Majesty were to free the slaves, this land would be lost, and such a great and rich kingdom as Mexico would become depopulated, end quote. In spite of the Audiencia objections, Charles reaffirmed his previous order and went on to promulgate the new laws of 1542, thus prohibiting new encomendandas and abolishing indigenous slavery in all case. In Spain, the new laws produced discontent, but the Spanish colonies, they caused outright rebellion. In Peru, a group of colonialists murdered the official sent from Spain to enforce the laws and then decapitated him. For a time, it seemed that Peru might even break away from the empire. Spanish slave owners in Mexico were no less determined. As in Peru, the Spanish crown did not entrust the execution of these unpopular laws to Spanish authorities in Mexico, but instead sent a high-ranked officer directly from Spain, Francisco Tello de Sandoval, a member of the Spanish Inquisition in the Church of the Indies across the Atlantic Ocean, disembarked in Veracruz and made his way to Vicereal capital of Mexico City, all the while sensing the tremendous opposition to the new laws. When he entered the city in 1544, he saw that some local officials were wearing mourning garb to greet him. As he met with the highest civil and religious authorities, the economy came to a standstill pending the outcome of this meeting. Tello de Sandoval could well have suffered the same fate as his Peruvian counterpart, but after much pending by Mexican slave owners, and perhaps sensing a fatal end to his tour of duty, the Spanish envoy agreed to suspending the new laws until he received further instructions from the king. Charles and the members of the Council of the Indies considered the situation and eventually consented to the granting of more encomiendas, and it was major victory for slave owners. The encomiendas remained in existence for another century and a half, affecting tens of thousands of indigenous people. Other provisions of the new laws were not suspended, however, and the crown continued to press for the abolition of indigenous slavery in the New World. Thus, the new regime emerged in the 1540s and 1550s, a regime in which indigenous peoples were legally free but remained enslaved through slight reinterpretations, changes in nomenclature. The practice meant to get around the new laws all over the Americas. And other slavery took shape as Spaniards struggled to implement the laws. Two opposing camps came into existence. On the one side were the adherent reformers led by Las Casas, who advocated for a broad, categorical, and literal interpretation of the provisions that abolished indigenous slavery without any expectation or qualification. On the other side stood officials and clergymen who understood the abolition was a noble goal, but insisted on certain expectations and limitations to make it viable. The two camps tried to resolve their differences at the high-level council held by Mexico City in December 1546. It was attended by Tello de Sandoval, Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, and the highest religious authorities in Mexico, including one other than Ferrer La Casa, who at the time was serving as bishop of Chiapas. The stakes were enormous. Bishop Las Casas and his allies pressed for an unconditional and immediate liberation of the indigenous slaves, while Viceroy Mendoza and other officials resolutely avoided making any pronouncements on the subject. When Las Casas expressed his displeasure at the lack of resolution, the viceroy reportedly said that, quote, he wishes to remain silent on the matter because of reasons of state. Viceroy Mendoza reasons for circumspection are obvious. Just 6 years earlier, Mexico had suffered its first massive indigenous insurrection that had started as an isolated attack on Spanish ranches in the coastal plains of western Mexico, had grown into a major anti-Christian movement in 1540 to 1542, eventually involving 15,000 rebels who nearly dislodged the Spanish presence all along the Pacific coast. The Spaniards called it La Guerrilla de los Panolas, a war of the mountaintops, because the rebels took up fortified positions in the mountains. It was also called the Mixtan War. Scores of Spaniards lost their lives in this upheaval, among them Pedro del Alvarado Cortez, main captain, military leader, and repugnantly the most daring and capable of all the conquistadors. Only a massive offensive organized in Mexico City, involved 30,000 indigenous allies and led personally by Mendoza, finally succeeded in quelling the rebellion. Spanish colonialists took at least 4,700 slaves during this bloody war. Moreover, in 1543, they sent a petition to the king asking for encomendas and perpetuity along 300-mile stretch of coastal plain between Compostela and, oh my gosh, the Calencan. They also requested permission to undertake extradas, exploring expeditions, and to enslave nomadic indigenous peoples who had been sympathetic to the rebels. These Spaniards were about to agree to a royal order abolishing indigenous slavery, quote, under any circumstances including war and rebellions, end quote. Many of the Audiencia of Mexico wrote as much to the king in the spring of 1545. The only way to induce settlers to fight against the indigenous peoples was with the promise of spoils of war, they argued. How could the land be pacified and the Spanish settlers mobilized without an inducement of taking slaves? This became a major quandary as the entire northern region of Mexico burst into open rebellion during the second half of the 16th century. Other doubts about the application of the new laws resolved around a new silver discovery. In September 1546, Spanish prospectors climbed a promontory crowned by the semicircular rock formation that would become the mine of Zacatecas. For 2 years, it was unclear whether this venture would be different from many other fleeting strikes. But the discovery of the Vidagrán large vein finally turned this promontory in the middle of the desert into a major pole of attraction. By 1550s, the Zacatecas had taken its place as the brightest star in the new constellation of mines that included Guanajuato and Chalchucahatis, the Avenos, Samberete, and others. Sorry, everybody, for mispronouncing those. Hello. Workers were urgently needed Workers were urgently needed at all of these mines, and the new laws were a stumbling block. All along, King Charles had been committed to abolishing all forms of indigenous enslavement. But when it came to protecting the silver and had started flowing into royal coffers, he and above all his sons and successors, Prince Philip, were willing to find a compromise. In 1552, Philip drafted a remarkable plan aimed at reconciling the new laws with the empire's needs. Indigenous slavery would be abolished, and the indigenous peoples working in the mines would be set free. To prevent disruptions in the production of silver, however, the officials freeing the slaves would explain to them that although they were no longer subjects to servitude of any kind, quote, they would still be required to work for their subsistence, and if they did not wish to work, they would be compelled to do so as long as they were paid, end quote. In this way, unemployed, or they use the L word, lazy, indigenous peoples would be rounded up and distributed to the miners in exchange for a nominal wage. Only the elderly and the and the ill would be spared. Philip's proposal had far-reaching consequences. During his long reign as King of Spain, 1556 to 1598, this system of remunerated but compulsory work of the distribution of indigenous peoples, known as repartimento de indigenis, or simply repartimentio, became widely used. The indigenous people were free, but they were still compelled to work. Since the new laws had been introduced in Spain in 1542, no legal procedure had been in place in Mexico to allow indigenous people to sue for their freedom. Finally, in 1550, a new viceroy, Don Luis del Velasco, 1550 to 1564, arrived in Mexico City bearing pointed instructions about liberating the indigenous peoples. He had a fable man. He was an fable man, perhaps genuinely concerned about indigenous people's condition. In the spring of 1551, Velasco appointed his procurador, a respectful lawyer named Bartholomew Malagerio, who held a position at the Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico. Malagerio's vast new duties included publicizing the abolitionist provisions of the new laws, assisting indigenous peoples in their lawsuits, liberating all indigenous people, minors held as slaves, making sure that freed indigenous people who had been brought from distant places such as Yucatan and Guatemala be restored to their communities. All of this made for a tall order, but the learned Guerrero seemed up to the task. First, the most important, Guerrero had to decide whether to adopt a literal interpretation of the abolition of indigenous slavery, quote, under any circumstances, end quote, and without expectations and qualification, as Bishop La Casa wanted, or to opt for the more nuanced and practical approach favored by many mine owners and officials. As Guerrero began his deliberation, he felt the need to write a letter to the Spanish king, laying out his position. Ever the university professor, Guerrero was drawn to find distinctions in complex reasoning involving divine and human law. After his opening remarks, the procurador concluded that, quote, some indigenous peoples had been made into slaves properly and justly, while others had not, end quote. He thus took the side of the pragmatists, rather than pushing for a blanket abolition of indigenous slavery. He spent years considering each case on its own merits. In one decade, Guerrero freed 3,150 indigenous slaves, a small fraction of the 100,000 or more of them in Mexico at the time. The trial transcripts are missing, or at least have not been found. So all we know about the trials comes from the reports written by the procurador himself. The procurador, I don't know how to say it. Let me look up this word. Right back. P. Spanish, that's why I can't say it correctly, himself. Basically, it's a lawyer or a person that, for the courts. Still, it is possible to glean some sense of how they progressed. Since first, Guerrero believed that some slaves were justly made and others were not. On the island of Espanola, and the procurador had granted freedom automatically to all petitioners. In Mexico, indigenous slaves faced long and arduous legal fights and therefore had strong incentives to settle their cases. Especially in the early years, trials could last a year or longer. During each time, many of the slaves either died, fled, or found an accommodation with their masters or some other individuals. Slaves often dropped their lawsuits after agreeing to serve their masters for a few more years while receiving token salaries. In this sense, they remained, quote, in deposit with their former masters under conditions that could not have been much different from slavery. It is also evident that Guerrero bowed to political pressure in some of his decisions. For example, many lawsuits were initiated by indigenous people from Western Mexico who had been captured during the Mextan War. Because that uprising had been so serious, the Audiencia of Mexico had declared illegal the enslavement of the former rebels, who numbered in the thousand. Guerrero had the authority to overrule the Audiencia, but in the end he went along with its decision and refused to liberate any petitioner involved in that war. Perhaps the greatest challenge to Mexican authorities was what to do with the indigenous peoples working in the mines. They had been reluctant to liberate these indigenous peoples out of the fear of disrupting the colonial economy. According to the account provided by a member of the Audiencia of Mexico in 1550s, when indigenous peoples toiled in the nearby mines of Texcoco, Zeltepeca, and Zumpango, arrived in Mexico City to request their freedom. They were ordinarily returned to their owners if they had brands on their face. The brands were considered sufficient proof of their servile status. And the most common outcome is that the owner gets his slave back, and in the case ends there, and the indigenous person continues to as before, as not worse, because he infuriated his master. Indigenous people who worked in distant mines on the frontier were even more disadvantaged because they had to travel great distance to Mexico City to appeal for their freedom. Occasionally, the crown sent vestadores or inspectors to the mines, in which case the indigenous people could present their petition to the inspector. In 1550, Hernando Martinez de la Marcha had made the rounds of several mines, a man of great energy and strong opinions. Martinez de la Marcha traveled through western Mexico almost continuously for years, sometimes on horseback and other times on a litter carried by indigenous peoples, and a mode of transportation that raises someone's eyebrows. Undaunted, the vestidor wrote reports about unsettled conditions of the frontier and the convenience of making indigenous people slaves. When mine workers approached him to request their freedom, far from liberating them, he admonished them to obey their masters. In spite of the Crown's insistence, the New World liberation were few and extremely difficult to accomplish. The specific application of the new laws in various colonies differ, but the results were much the same. In Venezuela, for example, the laws, and specifically the prohibition against indigenous slavery, were made public but not enforced. Slave raids continue in Cubagoa and Margarita, even though royal officials were well aware that such activities were strictly forbidden. Colonialists in Venezuela generally refused to give up their indigenous slaves and insisted that the brand on a slave's face was sufficient title and reasons to keep him or her in bondage. They also retained the service of a class of indigenous peoples known as the Nabaras, who were indigenous servants attached to them for life. The only difference between Nabaras and outright slaves were that Nabaras could not be legally bought or sold. In contrast, in Central America, an uncompromising and vigorous royal official named Alonso Lopez de Caroto embarked on blanketed liberation of indigenous slaves. Next to Bartholomew de las Casas, Caroto ranks as the most adherent champion of indigenous liberty of the 16th century. As the president of the Audiencia of Central America, Judge Caroto prosecuted slave takers, criticized officials who, quote, preferred to make friends with the colonialists rather than applying the new laws, end quote, and refused to make invidious distinctions among indigenous peoples to justify the enslavement of some of them, as happened in Mexico. Careto's vigorous reforms ended formal indigenous slavery in Central America, restricting the use of Narabas and regulating the use of indigenous peoples as tamimis or load bearers. But even these victories proved temporary. Caroto acquired a reputation of being an overzealous crown official and died in 1555, largely repudiated by his fellow colonialists. After his passing, subsequent officials reversed some of his policies. The Narabas returned indigenous people, load bearers, proliferated, and many indigenous peoples, though technically free, were compelled to render, quote, personal services to the Spanish colonialists under various guises. Overall, Spanish American slave owners, indigenous slave owners, and colonial authorities devised subtle changes in terminology and newfangled labor institutions to comply with the law in form but not in substance. Frontier captains no longer took indigenous slaves, but rebels or criminals who were formally tried and convicted, forcing to serve out sentences of 5, 10, and 20 years, and sold to the highest bidder. Colonialists in Venezuela and the Caribbean resorted to Narabas, while those in Central America continued to receive personal services. Throughout the 16th century, ranchers in northern Mexico relied on encomiendas that, unlike those of central Mexico, often amounted to cyclical enslavement, as they gathered their, quote, entrusted indigenous at gunpoint and forced them to work during planting and harvesting times. Miners in many parts of the New World relied on the repartimento system, in which indigenous peoples received token salaries but were otherwise compelled to work. In short, Spaniards adopted indigenous slavery to fit the new legal environment, and thus it became the other slavery. The traffickers and his network. Chapter 3. Throughout the hemisphere, Spaniards chanced upon indigenous village or nomadic bands and snatched a woman or a couple of children to make a tidy profit. While consistent, these spurs of the moment kidnappings were narrow in scope. The real slavers, the individuals who truly benefited from trafficking humans, operated on a much larger scale. They planned their expeditions carefully, procured investors and funds for weapons and provisions, hired agents to sell the slaves in mines and other enterprises, and because indigenous slavery was illegal, made sure to exploit loopholes and elicit plenty of official protection. Frontier captains were ideally suited for this line of work. As the empire expanded prodigiously during the 16th century, from them, slavery was no sideline to warfare or marginal activity born out of chaos and of conquest. It was first the foremost of business, involving investors, soldiers, agents, and powerful officials. Perhaps no one understood this better than Luis del Carvalho de la Cave, a frontier captain who had occasionally to operate in Africa and America, and to deal in both black and indigenous slaves. His activities gave us a rare opportunity to compare the slave trade on two continents. Carvalho was more colorful and baffling than many fictional characters. Born to a Jewish family in 1537, he spent his early years dodging the long arm of the Inquisition. Many years earlier, in 1492, the Spanish monarchy had expelled all Jewish people from the empire, forcing them either to convert to Christianity or to leave. At least 100,000 Jewish people left Spain. The majority went to neighboring Portugal, but this solution proved only temporary, as the Portuguese crown issued its own decree of expulsion in 1496. Already uprooted, once many Jewish families stayed in Portugal in spite of the risk. They remained close to the border between Spain and Portugal, the Lemon area known as the La Rari de Portugal, the line of Portugal, in case they needed to cross into Spain if pursued by the Portuguese, then cross back into Portugal if run out by the Spanish. Straddling the border became a common survival strategy for many practicing Jewish people. Luis de Carvalho spent his earliest years negotiating with turbulent waters in the town of Mango d'Oroa on the Portuguese side. But when the Portuguese Inquisition began investigating neighbors and friends of the Carvelas, Louis was promptly shipped back to Spain, ostensibly to further his education, but more likely to steer him away from the trouble, as Samuel Temeckin's recent biography shows. Just seven or eight at a time, Louis would go on to spend 6 years in the household of the Count of Benavente, where he perfected his Spanish and surely acquired a solid Catholic education. After the danger had passed, one of his uncles, a larger than life figure named Darty Delon, personally journeyed to Benavente to bring Carvalho back to Portugal, this time to Lisbon, and into a new start in life. At 14, Louis had reached what in the 16th century was considered a working age. Doltaire Le Delaune was a very prominent merchant, even though he was a new Christian, that is, a Jewish who had recently converted to Christianity, or possibly a crypto-Jewish person. Still practicing his faith secretly, his business contacts reached up to the highest level of the Portuguese court. D'Arte Delaune served the king as a slave broker in the 1550s. The Portuguese crown was in the habit of auctioning off to well-heeled individuals monopoly rights to such crucial Portuguese outposts in Africa as the coast of Guinea, the fort of São Jorge de Mana, and the island of São Tomé. Several of these bidders were new Christians whose finances were undiminished by their forced conversion, and who appreciated the religious freedom of Portugal's overseas colonies. D'Arte Leone acquired the trading rights to, quote, the River of Guinea and Cape Verde Islands, but there was only so much he could do from Lisbon. To profit from his concessions, he needed agents in Africa and business networks. Carvalho was 14 or 15 when he started working for his uncle in the Cape Verde Islands. Even for some like him who had seen slaves in Portugal, an experience of Cape Verde must have been eye-opening. Located 400 miles away from the westernmost tip of Africa, the archipelago was remote and forbidding. Winds from the southern Sahara blew all the way to these 10 islands of 5 islets, sweeping them barren. Only Fago and Santiago received much rain. The principal product of these islands were evident on arrival. Santiago, where Carvalho established himself, had a total population of around 13,400. Of these, 11,700 are nearly 90%, were African slaves forcibly transported from the mainland. Some of these slaves toiled on a few scraggly plantations. But most of them merely waited to be resold. The island was like a gigantic holding pen. Cape Verde's speciality was supplying African slaves to Spanish America. Because the Spaniards possessed no slaving ports of their own in West Africa, they had to rely on the Portuguese to obtain black slaves. Cape Verde was ideal for this purpose. The archipelago lay in the same latitude as Spanish Caribbean and was 400 miles closer to it than the African coast. As in all forms of commerce, time was of the essence. But this was practically so in a business in which the length of the passage determined the survival rate. Every additional day of travel represented more dead slaves and lost profit. By virtue of being a part of the African closest to Spanish America, the Cape Verde Islands developed as a prominent re-export center for slaves. I'm going to show you the picture. See, there's Spain. There's Cape Verde. Yep, there's Africa. And then, boom. There you go. Very close. In 1551, the young Louis de Carvajal, I can't do the Vajal, started his work in Cape Verde as a trade agent, quote unquote. 8 years later, he was appointed, quote, royal treasurer of the assets of those who died or became absent from the islands of Santiago and Fogo, end quote. Consider that, someone should bring you up. Muhammad, you got to come up, Muhammad. All right. Considering the Cape Verde lay 2,000 miles from Portugal, that deaths of disappearance were common, and that on average every Portuguese residing on the island of Santiago of Fogo possessed 9 or 10 slaves. This appointment gave Carvajal considerable access to unclaimed slaves. However, Carvajal's commercial success owed less to his business acumen than to his membership in the family trading syndicate spanning Portugal, the African coast, and Cape Verde Islands. The head of the syndicate was Dorte de Leon, who owned the trade rights to, quote, the river of Guinea, and Cape Verde Islands, end quote. From his headquarters in Lisbon, he negotiated slave contracts and oversaw all operations. The Card brothers, Francisco George de Leon, was in charge of the coastline in Guinea. He was posted in the minuscule village of Domingos at the end of a river that brought more slaves from the interior of Guinea than any other. Completing this triangular network was Carvajal in Cape Verde. As a trading agent in a slave re-export center, he was principally concerned with selling slaves to captains headed to the New World. He could purchase these slaves locally and even procure them from diseases, slave owners, or those who have gone missing. But Carvajal's chief advantage over his competitors was his ability to get slaves directly from the source in Domingos. In other words, Carvajal's could always, I have something in my eye that won't go away, could always undersell all other slave merchants because his uncle Francisco George de Leon controlled the cheapest and the most abundant source of slaves on the coast of Guinea. Jesus Christ. There we go. Oh, damn. I hate saying this person's name. Carvajal may have lived out his whole life on the African island had it not been for the arrival of a fantastic business opportunity. In the early 1560s, the Portuguese and Spanish monarchies began negotiating a major slave contract. Cape Verde was to supply 8,000 slaves over a period of 4 years at the price of about 100 ducats apiece. The King of Portugal sent a representative to Seville to settle the last remaining details. It is probable that Dorte de Leon needed representation for the negotiation at Seville, and what better choice for such a task than his own nephew, who had grown up in Spain, could conduct himself. In 1564, Carvajal traveled first to Lisbon, where he stated briefly, and then to surveil, where he remained for 2 years as negotiation first stalled and finally broke down. The two Liberian monarchies could not agree on a price. It must have been a major setback for Darty de Leon Syndicate. But by then, the former agent of Cape Verde was already dreaming of new ventures of his own network in the New World. The Panku slaves, the Panchu, it's Panuco with the hyphen on top of the A. I don't get it. Like, I'm not sick, but my nose likes to run a lot. Likes to run a fucking lot. Carvelo's travel to Mexico in the summer of 1567 was a man of means and enterprise. He took his own ship, carried a full load of wine, and transported several passengers, including high-ranking officials. He settled in the province of Panuco, a marshy area of the Gulf of Mexico to the south of Texas, a province that was well populated and easily accessible by land and sea. Panuco had been an active slaving ground for decades. Early Spanish colonialists were delighted to learn that the natives of the area did not have, quote, universal lords like the Aztecs or the Tarascans. I can't say it. But the individual chiefs, and that they waged war, quote, as if they were Italian city-states, end quote, and took captives from one another. Faced with these propitious circumstances, settlers began acquiring natives as early as the 1520s and selling them to slave traffickers of the Caribbean. Panuco initially funneled many slaves to the gold fields of Cuba and Hispaniola. This trade flourished, especially under the energetic governorship of Nuno de Guzman, who issued licenses to all Spanish residents. Quote, so each of them could take 20 to 30 slaves. Guzman also fitted out his own ship, which he loaded with Panuco indigenous peoples to trade for cattle from the islands. The first bishop of Mexico, Friar Juan de Zamargara, estimated that by 1529, quote, around 9 or 10,000 braided indigenous people from Panuco had been traded for animals. This barter was so brisk that Panuco experienced what some scholars refer to as an, quote, ungulate explosion. What is that? Ungulate explosion. We're going to find out what that means. Ungulate explosion. Northeastern Mexico amassed the largest cattle herds in 16th century North America and paved the way for the ranching empire that would flourish from Texas in the later centuries. By the time Carvelo arrived in Panuco in 1567, the local traffickers were no longer selling slaves in the Caribbean. the development of silver mines in central and northern Mexico in the 1540s and 1550s had completely transformed the slave trade. Panuco merchants had reorientated their businesses away from Cuba and Hispaniola and towards the interior of Mexico, organizing caravans and pioneering new land routes to principal mining centers there. When Carvajal arrived, he simply adapted to the system of enslavement already in place. The most significant testimonies about the workings of the Panuco slave trade come not from indigenous victims, but from a band of English pirates who washed up on the Gold Coast in October 1568. The Englishmen hacked at the brambles and bushes that tore their clothes and assaulted their bodies. They made their way through the thickets of grass that grew taller than a man, so we could scarcely see one another. Replacing one of the men, Miles Phillips. As the day passes, the pangs of hunger increase. The morale plummeted. The pirates disagreed about how best to save themselves and went their separate ways. What had once been the contingent of 114 men splintered into several smaller groups, reducing their ability to resist indigenous attacks or capture by Spanish authorities. Phillips cast his lot with the group of that. Oh my gosh. Hold on a second, everybody. I have to do something. God damn it. Okay, good. Sorry. Phillips cast his lot with a group that chose to travel south along the coast, hoping to find a town that would take pity on them. These raggedy Englishmen were themselves slavers. A year earlier, they had arrived at Plymouth, England, to sign up for what must have seemed an exceptionally promising expedition. Queen Elizabeth, along with 30 merchants from London, had invested heavily in the ventures. John Hawkins, a legendary privateer, on his third slaving voyage, took command of the fleet, accompanied by M. Francisque Drake, afterward knight. The ships headed first to Cape Verde and the coast of Guinea, where they procured, quote, very near a number of 500 black people, and then crossed the Atlantic and lurked in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico to search for buyers. Problems arose when the pirates became overconfident and entered Mexico's principal ports and Veracruz, where they were hemmed in by a Spanish fleet. The ensuing battle resulted in the loss of all but 2 of the English ships. Hawkins and Drake were lucky to escape on these vessels, scampering north along the coast, but carrying too many passengers and too few provisions. Hawkins decided to put ashore more than 100 men, with the promise that, quote, the next year we would either come himself or else send to fetch them home. For 8 days, Miles Phillips' abandoned group managed well enough. According to him, the men were, quote, feeble, faint, and weak, but they resolutely walked along the coast, braving, quote, a kind of fly, which the Spaniards called the mosquito, that would suck one's blood marvelously. The pirates also ran into a group of Chichimeques, as Phillips called them, using a generic term applying to the hunting-gathering society of northern Mexico. In his opinion, they were, quote, very ugly and terrible to behold, on the account of their very long hair, quote, even down to their knees, and because, quote, they also were people of color, their face green, yellow, and blue. At first, the indigenous peoples attacked the Englishmen, mistaking them for Spaniards, quote, shooting off their arrows as thick as hail. But once they became aware of the strangers' desperate circumstances, they showed remarkable restraint, making the castaways sit down while they went through the pirates' belongings. Nomadic indigenous people took some colorful articles of clothes, quote, those that were apparelled in black. Then they did not meddle withal. I don't know what that means. And then left without harming them. The pirates' good fortunes ran out when they approached the Panuco River. Not having tasted water in 7 days, they rushed to the stream and drank in great gulps. They were resting still when they saw Spanish horsemen riding up and down the river on the opposite bank. Philip saw the Spaniards dismount, step into the canoes, and began crossing the river, their horses tied by the reins and swimming behind them. Quote, and being come over to that side of the river where they were, he wrote, they saddled their horses and came very fiercely, running at us. The pirates had no choice but to submit peacefully. With only 2 or 3 rusty swords in their possessions, it would have been futile to resist. Fighting was entirely out of the questions. They crossed the river in the Spanish canoes in groups of 4 and made their way to a nearby town of Tampanco. The Englishmen's lives were now in the hands of none other than Luis del Carvajal. The former Cape Verde agent had been in the port of Tampico for only a few months. He had bought a cattle ranch near town, and being a man of wealth, he also had purchased an appointment of alcalde adoranero or denaro, I don't know how to say it, or lower magistrate. At the time, the town had a resident population of about 40 Europeans and 150 indigenous people. It was Carvajal who had received news of the English pirates roaming on the Panco coast and had organized a troop of Spanish horsemen who had spotted the castaways on the river. When the prisoners filed into town, Carvajal interrogated them, quote, showing himself very severe. They threatened to hang them on the spot. After demanding the scant money and valuables they carried, he had the Englishmen locked up in a public jail, quote, a little house much like a hogsty, end quote, in the space so small that the men nearly smothered one another. And when they asked for the doctor to treat their wounds, they were told, according to Phillips, that, quote, we should have none other surgeon than a hangman, which should sufficiently heal us of all our griefs. The pirates remained in these conditions for 3 days. On the 4th day, Phillips and the others sensed that many Spaniards and indigenous people were massed outside the building. The captives feared the worst. When the doors opened, they filed out of the cell, crying to God for mercy. Waiting outside were several guards and a man with newly made leather halters. Uncertainly and the ever-present fear of immediate and painful death were key to the psychology of enslavement. Quote, with those halters, Phillips wrote, they bound our arms behind us, and so coupling two and two together, they commanded us to march on through the town, and so long the country from place to place towards the city of Mexico, which a distance in space of 90 leagues, 270 miles, from the hot and humid coastal plains of Panuco. The captors marched the English pirates in a very fashion and along the very routes that innumerable indigenous slaves had followed through towns and ranches, paraded and showcased for the benefit of potential buyers. Had the prisoners been, quote, Chechemekas, I don't know how to say it, they would have already been sold along the way. But since they were Englishmen, they were destined for Mexico City. Driving the caravan were 2 Spaniards and a great number of indigenous warders on either side with bows and arrows, lest we should escape. This method of transporting captives by tethering them in lines was common throughout northern Mexico and bore more than a passing resemblance to Africa. The Cofflins, caravans of shackled slaves. One of the Spanish guards was an old man whose task was to procure provisions. He went ahead of the moving body to warn the authorities in the next town and make preparation. Always short on resources, he had to rely on charity to feed and clothe the prisoners and attend to their medical needs. The other Spaniard was young and, quote, a very cruel captain. According to Phillips' account, he was responsible for preventing escape and for driving the column on schedule. He carried a javelin, and when other men with very feebleness and faintness were not able to go so fast as he required them, he would take the javelin in both of his hands and strike them with the same between the neck and the shoulders so violently, and he would strike them down. The driver would then say out loud, marchad. I don't know how to say this. This is all it is. March on, you English dogs, Lutherans, enemies to God. When the column entered New Mexico City, men and women came out to see them. Many were sizing up the English captives, already thinking how much to offer them. For 6 months, the prisoners remained in a hospital on the outskirts of the city. We were courteously used. Phillips observed philosophically, adding that they received visits from gentlemen and gentlewomen from the city who gave them, quote, sackets, sweets, and marmalades, and that very liberally? I don't understand. At last, the Viceroy of Mexico ordered that the men be transferred to certain houses of corrections in Tecacao, also on the outskirts of Mexico City, quote, which is like the Bradwell here in London. The young Englishman wrote, referring to the notorious English workhouses of paupers and criminals. Indigenous people were routinely marched to these houses of corrections and sold for slaves, some for 10 years and some for 12. Philip's heart sank to the ground. Quote, it was no small grief unto us when we understood that we should be carried thither and be used as slaves. We had rather be put to death. Spanish gentlemen and ladies gathered at the garden of Texcoco, belonging to the viceroy, in order to choose their English slaves. Quote, happy was he that could get soonest one of us, Phillips observed. Each new owner supply took his or her slave home, clothed him, and put him to work in whatever was needed, quote, which was for the most part to attend upon them and at the table and to be as their chamberlains and to wait upon them when they went abroad. Like the levered Africans who waited on their wealthy masters around Mexico cities, these Englishmen represented conspicuous consumptions meant to be displayed to house guests on outing. That didn't make sense. Ordinary indigenous slaves would not have fared so well. Some of the English prisoners were sent to work in the silver mines, but there too they received favorable treatment as they became, quote, overseers of black people and indigenous people that labored there. Some of them remained in the mines for 3 or 4 years, and in a strange twist of fate, became rich. The experience of Miles Phillips and the others differed in an important respect from those of indigenous slaves, but they were still subjected to the slavers' methods. They traveled from Penico in the Coughlin, were sold in the slave market of Texcoco, worked in the mines, and witnessed the living conditions of indigenous men and women in bondage. All right, that was hard. I don't know why. All right, hold on a second. Let me look ahead. 81. We got 20 minutes. 81. Might be able to make it there. Okay, 81. The Chichimeck Wars. The Chichimeck Wars. Carvajal's involvement with the English pirates was momentous, but his greatest challenge by far had less to do with raggedy Europeans than with indigenous peoples. Carvalhal arrived in Penico in 1567, coincided with the major escalations of the war against the nomads of northern Mexico. The Spanish pushed into the civil-rich land of Zacatecas and Guanajuatos, Durango, de Mazapil, and others had triggered early skirmishes that grew into a non-holds-barred struggle known as the Chichimeck Wars. At the time of Carvajal's arrival, the Terra del Guerrilla, or war zone, encompassed an enormous arc that stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic coast. Although Mexico City and its immediate surroundings remained eerily quiescent, Spanish colonialists and indigenous allies who ventured into the north found constant danger. They lived in the patchwork of newly founded silver mines, cattle ranches, supporting settlements, and a few roads. The rest was indigenous grounds, and the violence was ever present. Carvajal's chosen city, Tampico, lay right on the edge of the war zone. To the north began the lands of the Chichimecs. All one had to do was cross the Penico River to run into the roaming indigenous like the ones the English pirates had encountered in the fall of 1568. The Checamex Wars were all too real in Tampico. An English visitor recounted that during his brief stay there in 1542, indigenous raiders killed 14 Spaniards who had ventured just to the outskirts to gather salt. When we try to imagine this conflict, it is tempted to fall back on the imagery of Americans' 19th century frontier, where white settlers confronted equestrian indigenous societies such as the Comanches and the Utes that possessed firearms. Yet 16th century Spaniards faced a very different challenge. The Chichimecs overwhelmingly moved on foot, and they fought strictly with bows and arrows. Before engaging in combat, they took off all their clothes and taunted the Spaniards, who were attired in heavy coats of chain mail. They were each armed with only a bow and 4 or 5 arrows, which they could deliver with lethal speed and priming horn and firing hammer. Capture was frightful, quote, regardless of whether it was male or female, end quote, wrote an Augustin Ferrer, who had lived among, oh my gosh, the Guamars and the Guachicachalis, and was otherwise quite sympathetic to the nomads. Quote, the first thing they did is remove the top of the heads, taking off all the skin and leaving the skull clean, just like one takes a Ferrer's tonsure. Oh my gosh, I'm burping so much. Although scalps was initially fatal, the Ferrer met the Spaniards who had been scalped years before, and in a different incident, a woman who survived many days. The Checamecs were also known for impaling their victims, cutting off their arms and legs while they were still alive, and removing their tendons, which were used for trying arrowheads and shafts. Reports of robberies, killings, and auctions, all manner of atrocities poured into Mexico City as the entire Checamex arc burst into flames. The man held most responsible for doing something about the raging conflict was Viceroy Martin Araquanz del Almanzi. Can't say it. Like the Carvajals, Araquanz, I can't say his name, was a newcomer to the New World. In fact, he had traveled on the very feet that had interrupted John Hawkins Brazen's trading missions in Veracruz in 1568, and he was participated in the fierce battle that had resulted in the skinning of all but 2 of the English ships. Araquanz, I can't say his name, ordered to attack the pirates, had been risking, but it had paid off in the end. Araquanz had been pleased to learn a few days later that some of the Englishmen who had escaped from Veracruz had been apprehended by an energetic alcalde of Tampico. Thus, an early bond was formed between Araquanz and Cargillo, both of whom were firm believers of decisive action. Once in Mexico City, Viceroy, I can't say this guy's name, Irwiquez, turned his attention to the war in the north. He convened a high-level council in 1569 in which the 3 main religious orders and other clergymen and lawyers would decide whether the war against the Chechmicans might be considered just. This was hardly an arcane legal exercise, but rather an official ruling that would determine whether indigenous peoples taken in the war could be legally enslaved. Most of the councilors sided with the viceroy in calling the guerrilla a Faego Yayi Sagri, or the War of Fire and Blood, the designation that would permit the Spaniards to kill and enslave their indigenous enemies. Only the Dominican farers went against the general opinion by arguing with undeniable logic that the Spaniards, not the indigenous people, were the true aggressors, and therefore that the war could not be considered just, nor could the Chichimequis be enslaved. Strictly speaking, Viceroy Enriquez, I think it's Enriquez, could not grant a free hand to the Spaniards on the frontier. As such, a policy would be a violation of the new laws in 1542. The Spanish king was the only one who could grant the general exception of accepting regulations prohibiting the enslavement of indigenous people. So the practical inequines steered the middle course by calling it a war of fire and blood, but with the limitations of euphemisms. Chinepnex women and children could not be taken captured. Adults, males, had to be tried and found guilty of crime before their service could be sold. They could not be enslaved in perpetuity. I'll be right back. God damn, dude. Perpetuity. Sorry, everybody. Perpetuity. Where'd it go? But only, quote, held in deposit for the specified number of years ranging from 6 to 20. Let me make sure. I'm going to look ahead again because I'm getting... I wish my nose would stop. Oh my God. From the narrow legal perspective, these indigenous peoples would not be slaves, but rather convicts serving out their sentence. In an atmosphere of patent alarm over the nomads' assertiveness. However, the viceroy middle course drew sharp criticisms. The Archbishop of Mexico, Pedro Manuel de Cotorteras, was one of the viceroy's most noble critics. He believed that by assigning indigenous people to the soldiers would defeat them, as was a necessary reward for the frontier service, that the wars in the north would be endless if indigenous women and children could not be enslaved, and that no Spaniard colonialist would go to war if he had to go through the trouble of gathering information and determine the guilt of every indigenous person he captured. The Archbishop's views reflects a common opinion among colonialists and ranchers. The legal debate would rage for years, but for the time being, the viceroy had enough support to wage his war. Throughout the guerrilla war zone, he named captains to punish robberies and murderers to keep the Chichimequis at bay. In Panuco, he bestowed this title on Cavergili. The former agent of Cape Verde was now the viceroy, right-hand man of the northwest Mexico. Viceroy Enriquez orders to Cavergils spelled out the astonishing details and parameters of his enslaving activities. Captain Cavergils was to punish the rebellious indigenous people by executing the ringleaders and, quote, doing justice in the matter of war, end quote. As for others, indigenous peoples found guilty of crimes, quote, their service would be sold for 10 years, end quote, with the exception that, quote, no indigenous under the age of 12 can be sold in service. Carvajal soon demonstrated an uncommon talent for this endeavor when he and his men caught up with the offending Chichmecs. I can't say their names right. They carried out their orders to the letter, surrounding indigenous people, killing the leaders, and taking about 30 captives, whom he, Carvajal, punished in accordance with his commission. By 1576, more than 6,000 Chichmec indigenous people had been reduced to slavery and were living in central Mexico, according to the conservative estimate of the crown officials. Carvajal was now a full partner of the system of enslavement. It was a vast system that began with the Spanish king, even if only because he tolerated or overlooked the practice, passed through the viceroy and his advisor in Mexico City, and extended to the governors, captains, and soldiers, the indigenous allies who carried out the raids. It was not too different from the system Carvajal had known in Cape Verde. There too, it had begun at the top, with the Portuguese granting trade privileges for portions of Western Africa, which royal contractors and agents had proceeded to exploit. The main difference was that whereas in Africa, the actual catching of slaves had been done by, I'm not going to say that, that's not true. In the northern Mexico, Spanish or mestizo captain did much of the capturing. Even that would change, however, as the slave trade in the New World involved the passing largely into indigenous hands. Like the others, hold on, I'm going to make sure I'm at. Hold on, like this, 85. Okay, we're almost done. All right, like the other slaving systems, the one in North Mexico boiled down to pesos. The expeditions of Chichmec's land were expensive undertakings that required upfront outlays of cash. Each soldier needed to pay for horses, weapons, protective gears, and provisions. Experienced indigenous fighters estimated that the soldiers could not equip himself adequately for less than 1,000 pesos. Yet the crown generally paid a yearly salary of only 350 pesos, which was increased to 450 pesos after 1581. So the first thing a captain can do in order to attract soldiers and volunteers was to assure them that the campaign would yield indigenous captives. Without being offered a chance to capture natives, few would risk life or horse. Time and again, Carvajal faced this fundamental economic reality. On one occasion, in the early 1580s, when he was gathering men to put down an indigenous rebellion in Sierra Gorda, his volunteers became discouraged because they anticipated that the rebels would negotiate a truce at their approach. The Chichmecs were crafty, and this was a favorable tactic. In that case, the men would be left with no captives, and their provisions and other expenditures would be wasted. Would Carvajal pay the soldiers out of his pocket? To overcome this reluctance, Carvajal reported placed his hands on the crucifix and told the men that, quote, he swore by the gospel that even if the rebellious indigenous people came in peace, he would imprison them in such a way that for every 10 indigenous person they came in peace, 5 would remain in the land, and the other 5 would distribute to the soldiers. In short, punitive expeditions into the Chichmec's frontier were economic enterprises. Investors offered loans and equipment to the volunteers who would repay them through the scale of captives. at the end of the campaign, detailed records of such financial arrangements are rare, but the unhappy end of soldier Gaspar de Ribera gives us a glimpse. Ribera served under Captain Francisco Cano near the mines of Mazepil in the vicinity of Panuco. On October, I'm almost done, everybody. I'm trying to get through this. On October 1569, Ribera and his companions cornered a group of Chemeques in a cave not far from the silver mines. But Ribera stepped up to the entrance, and an arrow flew straight into his left eye. Another lodged in his head, killing him almost instantly. When the Captain Cano settled Ribera's estates, he discovered that Ribera was in partnership with a widow from Mazapil named Constanza del Andranda, with redoubtable frontierwoman had advanced horses and arms to the soldiers in exchange for half of his share of spoils. During the campaign, Ribera had earned Gawachekali indigenous peoples, a girl of 12 and a woman of 25. The captain felt compelled to honor the terms of Ribera's agreement with Alderada. I'm almost done. 2 more paragraphs. I'm having a problem finishing up, and like my reading is deteriorating. Oh my God. What page was I on? I just lost the page. What page? Fucking hell. Oh my fucking God. It's on 68? Oh my God. Anybody remember what page I was on? Please, someone tell me they know what page I was on. Please tell me what page I'm on. I think I did that one. What page was I on? Can someone help me, please? What page was I on? Anybody? Hello? I lost my page and I need only 2 paragraphs to go. Do you know what page I was on?
I don't know what page you were on. I wasn't reading along. I'm sorry.
Oh my God. I have no idea what page I'm on.
Well, we can estimate it. What page did we start on?
Hold on. Okay, here we are. All right, cool. Let's do this. He sold the indigenous peoples at the highest bidder, 70 pesos. Let me make sure. Yeah. He sold the indigenous peoples to the highest bidder, 70 pesos for the 2, and transferred half of the proceedings to the widow. The arrangement between Ribera and Alderada makes painfully clear how the expedition functioned as an investment vehicles and why soldiers were so keen on taking captives. Carvajal's established himself as an ample frontier captain, rounding up English pirates, subduing rebellious indigenous peoples, and blazing new trails. And as he made himself the master of Panuco, his ambitions grew. With the full backing of the viceroy, Captain Carvajal, traveling to Spain in the summer of 1578. to ask for royal contracts. It took him about 10 months of lobbying at the courts of Philip II, but the results were spectacular. Carvajal was named governor and captain general of the new kingdom of Leon, and the largest kingdom north of New Spain, Mexico, and comprised a gigantic quadrangle measuring 200 leagues, more than 600 miles north to south, and another 200 leagues east and west, encompassing all the modern states of, oh my gosh, Tamaulipas, Panuco, Nauvoo, Leon, and Coahuila, almost all the Zacatecas and Durango, and portions of San Luis Potosi, Noratia, Sinaloa, Chihuahua, Texas, and New Mexico. Captain Carvajal was already an integral part of the slaving system in northern Mexico. With his appointment, he would have tremendous autonomy to profit from the traffic of indigenous people, and even the opportunity to create his own slaving system. Done. Jesus. Oh, that last part for me was hard.
You did really good.
My reading was getting low and low and low. Do you have anything to say?
I really enjoyed the book, but no, I don't have anything to say specifically. I'm sorry. I don't have any criticisms of the book. I just really enjoyed it.
What'd you enjoy about it?
I enjoyed learning that how much slavery there actually was. Like, to me, this is just striking that we've forgotten all of this and we're not taught this in school.
We're not taught many things in school.
Yeah, but this is just something that we should have been taught.
Yeah, they won't teach us this. Why would they teach us this? It makes white people look bad. You know what I mean? They don't want to make white people look bad because white people is their fucking... Yeah. So, anybody else have anything to say? I want to come up and say anything. 86. Zenith of and downfall of a slaver. That's where we're at. 86.
Gabby's doing it. She's not coming up.
I know. They don't come up anymore. They don't even pay attention anymore. I think they're oblivious to lots of things. Yes, they made the British people. Yes, those English guys. But they still had privilege within that. They still got their freedom. They still got to make profits and money and stuff like that. So yeah, they got a little bit of that, but they still got the privilege of, being free and stuff. So yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate you coming up and trying to. Yeah, they came at it with money. Yes, exactly. All right, everybody. Well, since no one has anything else to say, I will go ahead and close it out. Too bad Gabby didn't listen and come up. That's a shame. All right.